Okay, so Janelle and Grant, it's 3 minutes past, so I think we'll get going. Janelle's giving me the thumbs up. Thank you. Just want to say thank you to everybody who's joining us today. We have 67 people on the Zoom call. For those of you I haven't met yet, my name is Alex Gill, and I'm the Executive Director of ONEIA. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Janelle Januszewski, and Grant Walsom is going to be giving our presentation today. I just wanted to thank you guys for coming and joining us today. This is the second of three sessions we're going to be offering in the excess soil and on-site soil management frame. The session today is a product of months of work by subcommittees and professionals at ONEIA. And it's a good example, I think, of what the Ontario Environment Industry Association does fairly well, which is getting environmental professionals together to deepen their scope of practice, talk about how they can work together, help interpret common standards, and also liaise with the ministry around how regulations actually practically play out on the ground and provide feedback back to them. So this is all part of a much bigger process that's been fueled by volunteers. And we're very fortunate to have Grant Walsom join us today for the presentation. Grant, I won't go into a lengthy introduction because I think you're very well known by this group. Grant, in addition to his accomplishments as an engineer and a consultant, is a former chair of the ONEIA board. So Grant, I turn the floor over to you and wish everybody luck with the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I see the number of participants is growing rapidly. I think we're going to have well over 100 if everybody who registered joins us. This is great, and we certainly appreciate your time and attention today. Today, we're going to talk about temporary sites, and this is one of the best practices packages that ONEIA graciously accepted when asked to do so by the Ministry of Environment. So the temporary sites are Class 2 management sites, and you'll see that term interchanged back and forth, but we'd like to call them temporary sites at this point. And this presentation has been generated around the best practices document that we generated through the work through 2020. Just a little bit of context and background. Reg 40619 on-site and excess soil management was announced in December 2019. And really the purposes of that was to reduce excess soil management costs through transportation and landfilling. But in doing so, the protection of human health and the environment was also very forefront and paramount in what we do here. Eliminating illegal dumping of excess soil, reducing the amount of clean soil that's being diverted to landfills, and really through extension of that, reducing greenhouse gas emissions through transportation of soils when it doesn't need to be done. The RCCO and OSPI generated a study a couple of years ago in determining an estimated 25 million cubic meters of excess soil is generated in Ontario every year, which most of it can be reused safely and should be found through beneficial reuse and finding ways to reuse it. And these tools that the ministry has developed should help us with that. So what did the ministry generate? The regulation 40619, which is law now, and implemented over the next few years, from January 1st of this year to January 1st of 2025, with some grandfather provisions that have now been extended to 2026. What this regulation does is exempts low-risk management activities requirements under environmental compliance approvals, as well as setting the stage on what can be done in the standards for excess soils for reuse, and identifies a rules document through adoption of the regulation. And the rules document identifies further details on how the excess soil beneficial reuse can be implemented, as well as how do you identify the qualities of those soils prior to movement, prior to excavation, and through the assessment of past uses, which is similar to a phase 1 environmental site assessment, sampling analysis plans, excess soil characterization reports, which are similar to a phase 2 environmental site assessment, and then storage rules, processing rules, tracking, the quality standards that I mentioned earlier, and the reuse rules. And again, those are adopted into Reg 40619 by reference. Ministry is also putting together a series of, I believe, 10 fact sheets that are still in development. In my discussions with my friends at the policy branch have identified that those are underway and coming soon, but are probably still a few weeks to a month out. This best practice that we developed amongst a couple of others that ONEIA was tasked in doing have been developed through industry stakeholders. So it's not an ONEIA product, but it's actually administered by ONEIA and developed by the industry stakeholders in the steering committees that we pulled together. Best practices themselves are not a requirement by law, but are recommendations and developed by the industry for use by the industry in Ontario. The documents themselves outline the regulatory requirements, as well as identifying more of a, excuse me, the word I wanted to use, it has escaped me, the digestion of it down to more of a layman's terms for each of those requirements, and then the regulation itself. And then we have the best practices for each of those requirements themselves. Our best practices may not be universally applicable, but stakeholders are encouraged to review them and understand them and integrate these best practices where they can be done. So as I mentioned earlier, ONEIA developed these 3 best practices. One of them is on hauling, the other is on qualified persons, and then this one today that we're presenting today on temporary sites. OSPI is also developing a best practices around reuse of excess soil at pits and quarries, which is going to be very, very helpful once implemented in the province as well. A municipal bylaw tool around excess soils has been developed by Canadian Urban Institute a few years ago, and it's being currently updated. So that's where we're at with some of the tools and processes for excess soil implementation in Ontario. So excess soil regulation, 40619. I want to talk about quickly just what it applies to, and we've got definitions of soil and excess soil, but excavated soil that will be taken off site, it will fall under the excess soil regulation. And unless you are prepared to follow the administration and implementation of Regulation 40619, the regulation itself and the rules document, your excess soil will be designated as a waste and can be regulated under Reg 347, as well as oh my gosh, I'm having trouble today with my words. The discipline that can go around it if you're not following the rules itself. As we said earlier, the new regulation is being phased in over the next couple of years. But excavated soil that's being taken off site, if you're following these rules, the excess soil itself can be reused as a beneficial reuse. As long as it's being reused for that beneficial purpose and not stockpiled, no excess soil, no environmental compliance approval will be required. However, the excess soil must be dry and the quality must be determined that it aligns with that beneficial reuse and the site is being reused on. If it's not dry, it must be dried either at the the project area, processed there, or at a local waste transfer facility, or sent to a facility that has an environmental compliance approval, or a site that has an instrument that allows for that. There's very few of those. They are out there, but there's very few that allow that. The reuse site also must consent in writing to the reuse of that soil so that it's not illegally dumped. And soil that is actually staying within the project area, so it's excavated and can be reused, will not be deemed a waste. So all of those things can be done without the use of an ECA, but are subject to those rules under Reg 406. So the stakeholders around temporary sites themselves would be the project leaders, and that's the person who's in charge of the excavation work and deemed control of the excess soil itself. And so that's either the project area or at the temporary storage site, which we'll talk about. And they usually have a qualified person who is working with the project leader and for the project leader. And usually the qualified person for both the project area and temporary soil site would be the same. However, there may be rare cases where a QP for a temporary storage site would be a different qualified person. Other stakeholders around temporary sites would be the Ministry of Environment, district office, municipality, and conservation authorities oftentimes, if it's in a certain area. So really, let's get back to what a temporary site really is. And in the regulation, it's referred to as a Class 2 soil management facility. And it's a waste disposal site where excess soil is managed on a temporary basis, located, owned, and operated by the project leader of the site or a public body. And where soil excavated, it can be operated without an environmental compliance approval. Again, operated by the public body or a project leader. And the soil there can only be stored for a maximum of 2 years, but can be extended up to 5 years with special approval from the Ministry of Environment. So you have to apply for that extension. The site itself can exceed more than 10,000 cubic meters of soil at any given time. We have a great case study that our friends at Eglinton Crosstown LRT provided us, and they were part of our steering committee. So we wanted to extenuate or emphasize, the use of a temporary site can be very beneficial. In this case, between October 2019 and July 2020, the temporary site used by Eglinton Crosstown received over 95,000 cubic meters of excess soil. And in doing that, they were able to reuse a lot of the soil on their project, and they saved over 20,000 cubic meters of backfill that would normally have been imported. Through use of the excess soil temporary site, they were able to ensure that movement of soil during their tunneling and excavation work would not be delayed through rain days and not being able to move soil off site, and be able to continue operation after hours. And they were able to save 28 days of excavation that would have been lost due to rain events, and able to accelerate their schedule by 161 days by able to move that soil to that temporary site when normally a gate would have been closed at a receiving site. The one that really caught my eye when we talked about this was the reduced truck travel that was encountered and benefited from by using this temporary site. And if they considered that a haul distance per load of reused backfill of 90 kilometers trucking distance, they were able to save a total distance of just under 200,000 kilometers of trucking, which is amazing and really should be celebrated and applauded, and really is a great testament of their employment of this temporary site and how the benefits of that. But when you look at the truck travel that was saved, really there's a number of things, but greenhouse gas emissions was reduced greatly. That was never quantified, but there's some models out there that would be able to quantify that, but it would be significant when you consider those distances traveled. And those things also had huge cost savings for this project. So not only is the decision on cost, but it's also on material savings, time savings, and reduction of greenhouse gases. So we do applaud this case study and Eglinton Crosstown in using this temporary site. So it's just an example of how you using temporary sites can really be beneficial. A quote by their deputy director of alignment, ensuring that the use of this temporary site de-risked their excavation schedules and reuse of materials, and ensuring the natural environment was not compromised by their activities. And their recommendation of implementation of temporary storage sites when applicable for projects. There's a life cycle around the use of temporary sites, and we're going to touch on these: site selection and permitting, the operation of the site itself, minimal processing, and then closure and rehabilitation of that site itself. When talking about site selection, project leaders should consider, zoning bylaws, reducing risk to health and safety of area residents, and ensuring that your complaints for the operation of that site are limited, and keeping sites away from, where possible, residential areas, and maybe employing them in industrial areas where you're less likely to receive complaints. There's other areas that maybe should be considered, such as Niagara Escarpment, watershed areas such as the Simcoe watershed that maybe should be avoided, or at least negotiated with the conservation authorities and provincial authorities. Project leaders should contact the local MECP district office for further guidance when doing site selection if needed. Getting your permits and your approvals, the project leader should begin consultation process as early as possible, identifying who those key stakeholders would be. And again, examples would be the MECP offices, regional directors, a municipality, could be a couple of levels there that need to be lower tier and upper tier, conservation authorities and conservation areas, and then the special environment areas that we talked about, such as Niagara Escarpment. Temporary sites should be operated in consultation with a qualified person, and hopefully the qualified person that you're using for your project is able to assist with your temporary site. QP can assist in making sure that the temporary site is constructed, operated, and maintained in a manner that ensures health and safety of the persons and prevents adverse effects from the use of that temporary site. In consideration with the EPA and Ontario Water Resources Act. Practices for your site preparation. When preparing a site, project leaders should generate the following: precondition and environmental survey, site grading report, traffic and transportation management plans for both on and off site, nuisance management considerations, so air, noise, dust, odor, and in doing that, reviewing the local noise bylaws, other zoning requirements, and employing preventable procedure and practices to ensure that nuisances are kept to a minimum. In our best practices document, we take things like the soil rules or the regulation and digest them down. And this is what it would look like in that document. And we'll go through some of the rules themselves on soil storage. But some of those rules would be any soil that's stored at a temporary site needs to be stored in a manner that does not cause any adverse effect. Again, storage limits are up to 10,000 cubic meters at any given time, and stockpiles on those sites must not exceed 2,500 cubic meters, and that's a pretty big pile. Soils that should be sampled and analyzed ahead of this temporary storage site, but in some limited instances that may not be possible. So if you're bringing soil that has not been characterized to your temporary site, it should be segregated from soil from other areas of your project area. with employing QA/QC protocols to be adhered to in consultation with your QP. It's not acceptable to mix soils from different sources unless those soils meet the same excess quality standard and be used for the same beneficial reuse. Further, stockpiles must not be placed within 30 meters of a water body and 10 meters from the edge of the property. Should be stored in a manner that prevents contaminants from being migrating through leaching into groundwater. And this could be accomplished through reuse of impermeable surfaces if they're available on your site, the placement of liners, and ensuring that drainage is maintained to the site, and containment practices, and if necessary, covering the piles themselves. There is a 2-year time limit from when the soil has arrived at the temporary site that should be taken to your end use site or your beneficial reuse site. This can be extended up to 5 years, provided that the timeline can be identified that to reuse that soil and getting the approval from the MECP director. Site operations themselves, when they're being designed, should consider storage and placement of the soil itself, traffic management in and out of your site as well as on the site itself, quality assurance and quality control of the soil, security for the site, load tracking, as well as being able to respond to different emergencies. So in terms of your storage and placement, operations of receiving, processing, and soil storage may need to address things such as air and noise, leaching, erosion, sediment controls as we identified. Operating within the noise bylaw should identify acceptable hours of soil movement, making sure you've got dust control, include sweeping, tarping of piles if possible, wetting techniques if needed during hot and dry periods, active dust control during storage, could be watering, calcium chloride application, use of vegetation, capping your stockpiles. Monitoring of soils for odor and organic components should have been done prior to use of the temporary site, but there should be protocols to address this if the site requirements for odor are not being met, and that soil should be quarantined, removed, managed appropriately. Attention should be made to seasonal variations, specific controls that need to be implemented. Example would be the wetting techniques for dust control. It may not be feasible in the winter. Odor control may need to be implemented during warmer months compared to colder months, or during areas or times when winds and breezes are higher than others. In terms of leaching, soil should store it in a manner that prevents any contaminants from the soil leaching into the groundwater or surface water. May require the placement of the soil on impermeable surfaces when they're available, or use of liners, drainage containments, where necessary, covering of your piles. Ongoing monitoring of the site should assess any damage to structures or potential sources of leaching. Erosion and sedimentation controls are to minimize the potential for erosion of the limited quantity of soil exposed and disturbed, minimize the potential for transport of suspended solid silts from the work areas to locations outside of the temporary site of the project area, minimize the potential for off-site transport of that material, and protect wetlands, water courses, storm sewers, etc., from intercepting erosion and sediment loading or other discharges from occurring. Municipalities may have specific erosion sediment controls outlined in their bylaws that may be employed at their temporary site. Excess soil on temporary storage site will be temporarily stockpiled. Some considerations to limit those erosions should be maintained with maintaining your maximum 2-to-1 horizontal to vertical slopes for your piles, constructed in a manner that doesn't allow for ponding of water, and tarp to mitigate erosion from rainfall. If the site has drainage infrastructure like storm drains, culverts, and ditches, attention should be paid to ensuring that infrastructure is protected from potential erosion related to stockpiled soils. Some measures for sediment control may include removing catch base and grates, adding geotextile filter fabric of the base frame, and then reinstalling the grate over the geotextile fabric, which would act as a filter. Hay bales and sand, wooden stakes, silt control socks around the perimeter of catch basin inlets and entries into ditches. Silt control fencing around the perimeter of the soil stockpiles or the site. And locating stockpiles in locations away from the ability to influence stormwater infrastructure. All these site control measures need to be regularly inspected and maintained to ensure that they are working effectively at mitigating erosion sediment loading. Traffic management. Owners and operators of these temporary sites should have traffic and transportation management plans that address some of the following concerns. On-site traffic management consideration should be made to the size of entrance and exit locations to allow for proper vehicular traffic flow, which are for trucks themselves, which are bigger than the average car, obviously. So sometimes the entrances and exits need to be made so that they can safely turn in and out of your site. Limit left-hand turns for trucks into a site or out of the site as well, where possible. Ensuring that traffic control personnel are present during peak traffic movement, mitigate impacts to local regional road congestion. Considering appropriate speed limits on your sites to ensure that safety as well as dust mitigation at times when trucks are moving too quickly, dust can be generated. Ensure that there's adequate space for vehicles to back up and turn around on your site. Limit queuing and parking on public roadways, which is very important. Limiting idling. Consider implementing not idling requirements and measurements and tracking of that on your site. And consider ways to limit your noise related to truck traffic. For example, configuring the site to use existing physical barriers such as buildings that may be there, fences, soil berms, etc., to act as sound barriers for your truck traffic. Mud tracking is important to mitigate that or prevent that. Common issues related to earthwork activities is tracking mud out of the site and onto public roadways. Truck traffic on site can lead to tracking of soil onto the arterial roads, exiting the site, leading to unsafe and nuisance conditions. Important to assess the site operations and mitigate mud tracking. Depending on the road designation, each regulatory agency may have specific requirements to address this issue. Proponents of these sites should ensure that they are in compliance and meeting the requirements of these agencies. Common methods of mud tracking reduction include mud mats with pathways constructed of angular material, a bed of 50 millimeters and 150 millimeter clear stone, which assists in removing the mud from the tires. On bigger and more sophisticated sites and where water services may be available, wheel washing and tire cleaning facilities may be implemented. The reuse of asphalt or concrete paved area surfaces where truck traffic can be minimized, tire contact with earth surfaces. Cleaning and sweeping of arterial roads and hiring street sweeping services when necessary, and restricting of operating hours during wet conditions. Assistance with traffic management is selection of haul routes between your project areas, your beneficial reuse sites, and the temporary soil storage site. And that should consider municipal trucking routes, local load restrictions, seasonal load limits, particularly those when frost is coming out, that period between March and May. Avoiding residential streets where possible. Attempt to avoid traffic congestion through through route selection and time of day considerations. Where possible, hauling routes should take the shortest available route or selected routes that will emit the lowest amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Temporary sites should have quality assurance and quality control program to assess soil quality and management of soils on site. The operator should consider implementing an audit sampling program to verify that the soil quality is compliant with the temporary and reuse sites. QPs are required to complete the assessment of soils for the site. They'll also be key in reviewing reports from inbound soils and verifying reuse site quality compliance for outbound soils. It's important to note that Class 2 management sites require an excess soil destination assessment report for each project that will be importing to the site. Further direction on what is required in that report has been outlined in the soils rule document. Soil quality and characterization should take place prior to the soils arriving at the temporary site, but in some circumstances, the temporary site may be used as a holding area to confirm quality. And as we talked about earlier, that soil should be kept separate from soils that has quality is known until it's been characterized. Rejected loads. In some circumstances, possible that off-spec or unsuitable loads are received at the site. Important that the operator and the QP develop a rejected load procedure. And this should address load inspections, operations of how you're going to quarantine loads, communication between applicable parties, the project leader and the project area on how to manage these rejected loads when they're discovered. And training on staff on how to identify, document, and appropriately manage loads that don't meet compliance. Site security, and we're thinking intuitively that it's not always something that you would consider for just a soil site. However, there should be a basic amount of site security, which would prevent trespassing, preventing illegal dumping, and mitigating nuisance of neighbors. Measures for site security will vary depending on the site characteristics, but should and could include the following. Fencing and gates could be snow fencing, temporary, fast fence, jersey barriers and blocks to prevent unauthorized vehicles coming on. Where applicable, indoor storage if soil volumes and facilities are available. Ensuring you've got appropriate signage. On sites where security could be even a bigger concern, you could have security cameras, gate personnel, and ensuring possibly that off-hour security staffing, inspection, and visits are conducted. Some temporary sites may become inactive for periods of time, say through the winter or during periods when the project area is not active, or when waiting for beneficial reuse sites to be ready to receive the stockpiled soils. In this case, the operator should still maintain irregular site inspections to monitor site conditions and site security to ensure that the quality of the soil that you have is not impacted. Load tracking is a requirement under the regulation. Excess soils are to be tracked from the project area until its final destination. The load tracking itself should have documented that the soils received with the following information: municipal address or site location of the project area where the excess soil originated, the date of the excess soil was received from each project area, total quantity and quality of the excess soil received, each segregated excess soil stockpile, the quality and quantity of excess soil, and the location of the project area from which it was originated, and confirmed reuse sites as part of the excess soil destination assessment report, the date of which the site, reuse site, class 1 soil management site or landfill or dump can start to receive the relevant excess soil. This is all through part of the hauling record and the tracking requirements. So if you're generating records for a temporary site, how long do you need to keep those records? Here's your options. A, I don't have to keep it. It's the responsibility of the hauler. B, 2 years. C, 7 years. Or D, forever. The answer is 7 years. The date of the delivery, hauling records are required to be maintained for 2 years under the regulation. Records themselves, there's a couple of benefits to both systems, either it's paper or electronic. Under the paper system, there's no special technology required to implement that, no energy, power to operate. It's generally easy to use, and it's really been the system that's been in place for many years. Drawbacks of the paper system is the paper tickets and so forth could be easy to lose, excuse me. And there's administration around the filing, scanning, record keeping, and being able to generate those documents when required. Filling things out by hand, the legibility can also become an issue at times. Versus electronic systems, where electronic can be integrated information sharing to reduce the administration, easy to look up and reference certain documents under the electronic system, and reduces the need for actual filing those documents. Drawbacks of the electronic system is it may require additional training in getting people up to speed on your system that you've implemented. And where big sites are going on, and you may have a number of subcontractors, so it may be very difficult to get them all in the same system. The regulation and rules does not specify one system over the other as long as you do have a system. Though it is not recommended or not required, it is recommended that hauling management companies, contractors investigate the use of electronic systems as they are becoming more widely available. When operating a temporary site, it's much like any other construction site or receiving site that you should have emergency planning activities in place. And that would be an emergency response plan or spill response plan. For an emergency plan, the following topics components should be part of that plan. Include emergency phone numbers for the police, fire department, ambulance, ministry, labor, and have those posted. Notification of key personnel and management as soon as practicable. Identification of an emergency response team. Site inspections to identify potential hazards. Doing a risk assessment around those potential hazards that could cause an emergency, such as fire, evacuation, and injuries. For spill response plans, sites are to be audited to determine if there are any hazardous substances that could cause health problems to workers if exposed, or an environmental problem if the substance is escaped or is accidentally released from its container, pipe, or hose. The biggest culprit for this may be fueling for your equipment and fuel storage facilities. Procedures may need to be developed to address issues around storage of chemicals, fuels, and liquids. Spill response equipment, including spill kits, secondary containment, fuel storage are essential for good site operations. Also have a plan that provides guidance in the event of a spill and proper contact list for spills notification, including regulatory agencies such as the Spills Action Center and Canutech, local municipal agencies as well. Other regulatory considerations around emergency planning could be the Ministry of Labor requires some emergency preparedness measures under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Environmental Protection Act around spill response, and the Water Resources Act for spills into waterways. Checking on our time here. Community engagement and ensuring that your community partners are aware of what's going on and implementing best practices in site selection and reducing your nuisances will help in limiting any complaints from your communities. Communicate information to the community and provide them with a point of contact. Part of that is ensuring that you have a good complaint response system. Each site should have a system in place for responding to complaints. Best practices around that should consider implementing the following practices when applicable. Create a communication and outreach plan to the community to create a communication flow between the temporary site and your area residents. Site signage should include a contact information or other information for communicating complaints if they so arise. Site signage could also state that the site is a temporary site rather than a permanent site and include projected dates of operation where applicable. Around the complaint response system would be a policy who is identifying who is responsible for responding to complaints, timelines for responding and investigating those complaints, and a process for recording and tracking those complaints. Under the approved soil processing activities, procedures and best practices employed will vary depending on the characteristics of excess soil being processed, the matrix variability of the materials, and the end product required by the reuse site. Proponents and operators may want to carefully examine processing techniques and the resulting reuse soil to ensure that the desired product is attained, mitigating the potential of rejected soils and unfortunate outcomes around the rejection of that. Operators processing excess soil may want to employ these control measures to discuss previously in this document to mitigate against fugitive releases and managing of nuisances. It is expected that all processing activities will be completed in compliance with the regulations and bylaws. Although OREG 40619 does exempt processing activities under some waste approval requirements, it does not alleviate proponents and operators from ensuring that they are adhering to other regulations or municipal requirements, such as Ontario Water Resources Act, Ontario Reg 419 respecting air pollution, Ontario Reg 347 respecting waste, and any local municipal bylaws that may be in place. Just to touch upon some of the approved soil processing activities, and these are classified as low risk activities, and they can be conducted as long as they are conforming with the soil rules and listed methods in the regulation, include passive aeration, soil mixing, soil turning, size-based sorting, and sorting for the purposes and screening for the purposes of removing debris. It is further identified that liquid soil processing is not permitted at temporary sites. Drying and dewatering of the liquid soil is permitted at the project area or the source site, as well as local waste transfer facilities and at ECA permitted sites in a handful of sites with instruments. Site closure and rehabilitation. Once you're done with your temporary site, it's important to be able to include certain activities such as post-condition surveys of the site, and you compare those to your pre-condition survey you did before you used the site. Reinstating any services that may be temporarily suspended for operations where necessary. Post-environmental monitoring and reporting around soil and groundwater quality sampling, analysis, monitoring itself. Restoration of grading and a plan around that. Restoration of any natural features, trees that may have been damaged, grassed areas, ditches, swales. Closing of site entrances and exits. Notification to the appropriate agencies of closure, such as the Ministry of Environment in a municipality. That's the majority of our best practices. We've developed a training module to go with these best practices. This is an example view of the one for the haulers. We also have one for temporary sites. And it's available on our website, www.onea.ca/excess soil. These training documents or tools are wonderful. Janelle put those together and they are in the Prezi style. You navigate through the training operations of this website on your own. So you push yourself through each of these bubbles in the training, in the Prezi platform, which keeps the person engaged and can be done in a group setting or on your own. And those are available for each of our best practices on our website. The development of these best practices could not have been done without the generous support of the following people and their firms where they're employed. And I'm not going to list them all, but you can see them there. They're listed, and these people gave up a generous amount of their time in assisting us in developing these best practice documents. And we'll leave it to Alex to do the last couple of slides, and thank you for your time today.
Great, thanks very much, Grant. And I think we will have maybe 5 minutes for questions. But we want to remind people that our third and final session is next week. So if you want to register for that, the registration links are on the ONEIA site. And as Janelle has said in the chat window and Grant has reinforced, all of the presentations and the information is all online. So if you missed a piece of something or you think, gee, somebody from my team should have been here but isn't, feel free to share the resources, share the recording, and the resources are online for everybody to download. And with that, we'll open up the chat window if anybody has any quick questions we want to pose. We have committed to get everybody out of here by 1 o'clock, so we want to make sure we have time to wrap. I will say before we open to questions that we do have subcommittees working not just in brownfields and soil, but in waste and organics and a whole bunch of other issues that are relevant to companies in this sector. So feel free to reach out to the office, connect with a committee, connect with Janelle or myself. We're always happy to talk about what's going on in the industry and where you might want to network and where you might want to actually build out and deal with some issues that everybody's facing. So with that, we open it up to any questions that anybody would like to pose in the chat, and happy to direct those to the appropriate place. We'll give it a few seconds for some people to type in questions if they have any. And this grant is in, oh, Janelle did send me one, hold on. With respect to tracking, are we required to track each individual load from source site to temporary site to final reuse site? What if soil is bulked or aggregated at the temporary site? How does that affect the tracking process? So if you're amalgamating, but you're tracking by load, how does that work? I think that's the nature of the question.
I don't think it would be practical to be able to identify exactly where the soil was if it was repiled on a temporary site. However, you should be able to generate tracking from the project area, the source site, the temporary site, and then what pile that goes in and where that pile ends up going at the end use. So you should be able to demonstrate that through your tracking system. The exact molecule of soil wouldn't be very practical to be able to do that, but you should be able to demonstrate through your paperwork and your tracking systems where that soil was and how it went from point A to point B to point C.
Thank you, Grant. Other questions that anyone would care to pose in the chat window? And invariably, Grant, this is where I often prematurely cut the conversation off. And just as I'm wishing everybody well, a question pops up, so we'll wait. Yeah, there we go. There's one right there. This question is not pertaining to temporary sites, but I was wondering if you'll be discussing exemptions at any time next week. I'm interested to know if resurfacing of roads is qualified. Usually small amounts of soil are excavated. Any thoughts on that, Grant?
Exemptions. We're not going to talk about that in particular. They're not around any of the best practices themselves. The exemptions go around, any exemptions are usually based around the use of the registration, the site registry that is coming as of January 1st, 2022. That registry is in development, but there are a series of requirements around when you need to register your site and those exemptions. There are other opportunities for exemptions on what you maybe need to sample for and those types of things, and that would be identified during your assessment of past uses. But at this point, we won't be discussing exemptions per se any further than probably what we just discussed.
Great. We have two more questions from the chat. One is from, and thank you, Raha, for that question. The next question is from Denise Machine. For the sample project you mentioned, what were the size of the stockpiles? Considering the project managed about 100,000 cubic meters of soil, under the new regulatory requirements, would they have been able, or would they have been, or would it have been practical to keep stockpiles at 2,500 cubic meters each?
Yeah, that example project, yes, it was a large volume, but they didn't have all that soil on site at any given time. So it wasn't like they brought 100,000 cubic meters of soil on the site and kept it there. It was through management through that period of time that site was being operated. So at any given time, I'm not exactly sure. I wasn't involved with the project itself. However, it was a fluid site. So there was soils coming in and then being reused in the project area, and maybe aspects of some of that material being able to be reused, and then some of it going to beneficial reuse sites themselves through that time. So the actual operation of that site was to assist in being able to store that soil, to bring it back, or when during downtimes, and to maintain excavation beyond the normal business hours, where you wouldn't be able to maybe transport that soil into a gated facility. So it would have been managed at that time, but I can't answer any more questions on that. However, if you want to send me an email directly, I can put you in touch with that person who provided that information, and you'll be able to ask them directly.
Great. And we have two final questions, and I think we'll cut it off after Janet's question. But we have Juan, who's asked a question. Could you please discuss the requirements for temporary storage of contaminated soils?
Contaminated soils, that's a whole different regime. You have to remember that we're talking about excess soils that can be reused in a beneficial reuse setting. If the soil is contaminated, it may require treatment or disposal under the waste operations that has been normally done in this province for the past number of years. And the management of excess soil is generally around the beneficial reuse of soils that are non-contaminated or marginally contaminated, but can still be reused on a site that would be able to accept that material. So for storage of those of contaminated soils, you would have to go back and look at what those activities would be under the waste regulation, or some of the activities that we identified that would occur on a temporary site, such as ensuring you're not going to get leaching and ensuring that it's not mixed with other soils that are not contaminated, those types of things. So you'd have to consider that.
Okay. And we have a question from Janet Babechko. Grant, is there a recommended practice about what to do or how to close a temporary site when it's no longer required?
Yeah, we went through some of the activities that would be recommended, and ensuring that you're returning the site to a state that was established before the use of the temporary site, and making sure that you're doing things like environmental monitoring and reshaping the site and restoring drainage swales and closing off your site accesses that weren't there previously, those types of things. So there's a number of things that we went through, and they are identified in the best practices.
Okay. And just a quick question from Christine. Could you discuss the volume of soil issue? Is the volume of excess soil removed to be determined based on in situ calculations or ex situ?
Could you say that again? Sorry, I drifted for a second.
No worries. Christine had a quick question around the volume of soil. Is the volume of excess soil to be removed determined based on in situ calculations or ex situ calculations?
You can use either, because you may have a soil stockpile that was already pre-excavated, and you may determine it from that. Or you may, in determining your size, have done it previously, where before you excavated it, you may identify what your soil would be, the volume would be at that time. But if you're talking about storage limits, it would be for the soil that's actually there ex situ.
I'm going to squeeze in one final question, Grant, because I know we're at 12:58, but this is a question from Mukesh. How will excess soil or temporary storage be applicable to granular material, granular A or B with sand, gravel, crusher run limestone, if it's contaminated or not, since granular is not soil, e.g. it's from a natural breakdown process? Any thoughts around that? Very
If we're talking about clean aggregate materials, they're not subject to the excess soil regulation. If we're talking about recovering that material, those rules could be still in place. So if we're excavating from an area and want to reuse that material, then it would fall under those regulations. But if we're talking about clean aggregate materials coming from a pit or quarry, they're not subject to the regulation of excess soils, and that's clearly identified in the regulation itself.
Great, thank you. I know there's probably appetite to have more questions, but we do commit at ONEIA to make sure we end on time. So we do have, it's 12:59. I want to say again, a thank you to Grant and the teams that have been working on this of ONEIA members. Thanks to Janelle for all the work putting everything together. And thank you, by the way, for everybody who joined us today. We had, north of 85, 90 people joining us. So it's always very good to share this kind of information. So thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing many of you on next week's call, which is our final call in this series. Thanks to everybody, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.